First thing, standards-based. One of the interesting things about platforms, and perhaps counterintuitive in terms of how we think about the politics of platforms, that is, the politics of platforms, I mean just in the most general sense of here's the platform we have, what's the platform we want there to be, and who gets to decide what platforms there will be that will organize this in our own way, is the reliance on very specific kinds of standards to organize the coordination of things that would that this platform would govern in whatever kind of way. You can think of it, and we talked a bit last week about TCP/IP, and the OSI, and these sorts of standards, these sorts of protocols that allow the internet to work the way that it does. Just to take the simple example, the TCP/IP communications protocol, it's a set of instructions that basically, if you're going to have one device that is connected to the internet, to be able to send information to another device that's connected to the internet, it has to structure that information and sequence that information and send messages indicating that it has received that information in various rhythms and patterns and structures to that other device in this particular kind of way. Okay, so long as the device sends and receives information according to that set of rules, any device can be connected to all of the other devices in principle, right? So it could be something that looks like a laptop, it could be a refrigerator, it could be a sensor on a leaf in a rainforest, it could be anything. And this is kind of the interesting thing about this. Maybe it would take the bit paradoxical, and that is if you try to make, we start with this point that platforms are rigorously and inflexibly standards based. That is, if something wants to connect to the internet, you've got a better idea for an information, sharing, handshaking protocol than TCP/IP, which is a really old protocol. There's all kinds of things wrong with it. It's very slow in a lot of ways. And you want to write this protocol and you want to connect to all the other things on the internet, good luck to you. Because you have, in essence, everything else would have to, in order to change, in order to accommodate this new system that you've put in place. And in the taking the internet as an example, in some of the early days of the consumer internet, the early and mid 1990s, you had closed systems like CompuServe and AOL and so forth, which these sort of Paleolithic online communities that in fact had their own communications protocol. And so literally, if you weren't a member of CompuServe, you could not send email to a member of AOL. If you were a member of open internet, like the Well or something, you could not receive email from someone on AOL. And so because there was not a single standard that would allow any of these devices, and then the humans who own those devices thereby, to send stuff to each other, they in essence were balkanized. They were sort of cordoned off from one another in a particular sorts of ways, right? They became, if not walled gardens, at least separated cul-de-sacs, if you like, within this whole system as such. Now, let's think of this in terms. Let's think of it also in terms of this. Does that imply, given that's the case, that in order for something to participate in a platform, it absolutely must, 100%, no exceptions, must abide by the protocological system that this platform specifies. But once it abides by that protocological system that this platform specifies, anything and everything in the entire world is then thereby allowed to participate in the platform. Does that suggest that platforms are highly restrictive or extremely open? Does that suggest that they're hierarchical or non-hierarchical? Does that suggest that they're open or closed? Kind of both is right. And this is kind of interesting, perhaps sort of the interesting paradox of platforms, is that their capacity to produce essentially network effects that are flat, that is non-hierarchical, that are open, anything can connect and participate, that are in their own way sort of universal in that they are able to accommodate the movements and integration of any number of kinds of things, is actually dependent upon. It's a direct function of the fact that they have this very rigid, specific, inflexible mechanism that polices and structures the terms of participation. Now this is kind of, in a way, if you think of this, now if we're taking this not just as a technical system, but also as an institutional model, this is a bit counterintuitive, perhaps, to the way in which we normally think about sorts of systems. We normally think of it as a kind of, perhaps you're more sophisticated in this, but we normally think of this as a sort of along a spectrum of open to closed, democratic to authoritarian, flexible to inflexible, hierarchical to non-hierarchical, and that these would all align along some part of this, along some part of the spectrum. And that the idea that you would have open, universal, accessible mechanisms that would allow for anybody or anything to participate on its own, and send anything to anybody else without going through any kind of centralized mechanism or structure, would not only would suggest, but would even, we might, as we normally would think of it, would require a mechanism that itself was just as flexible and libertarian, if you like, at the technical than its effects. It's this strange, perhaps counterintuitive asymmetry between the means and the means and the ends, the structure and the effect. That's part of what we're interested. That's part of what makes platforms quite interesting in this regard. There are things that don't. There's lots of things that don't abide by platform logics, and I also would want to suggest that these are. Platform is I think is a way of just the term platform is an institute, thinking of it as an institutional form is a way of thinking about a kind of regularity of behavior of systems. There may be ways in which states operate like platforms, maybe a way in which markets operate like platforms, or maybe a way in which languages or quantitative systems operate like platforms. Metric system, you could arguably be platforms, but I think it has more to do with these other types of parameters and the terms of participation that it has, which we'll get into a little bit more detail, which we'll get into more detail here as well. Platform is not just that there's a standards-based system that allows for interoperability, but it also requires a certain sort of growth as well. You could think of this platform a bit more also like a lattice work on which the ivy might grow. Right? It's not necessarily determining the vectors and morphology of the ivy, and it's not necessarily ensuring that the sun will shine and the water will be thing, but it provides, in essence, a mechanism for it. You can also think of this, now back to the grid system for a moment, in terms of the generative capacities of platforms, which is what we'll get to a little bit as we go further into these details. That they structure the form that essentially that grows on them in a true way. If you think back to Kohlhaas's Delirious New York, which is his first major book, 1978, that architecture students you should at some point in time take to the beach with you and read through.